This video presents declassified and licensed material of the Global Institute of Logic and Cybernetics.
The standard model of physics treats reality as isolated spheres bouncing in an empty void. But as we probe the absolute limits of the atomic model, that framework violently fractures. We assume matter is built from discrete, featureless beads. But at the quantum scale, particles exhibit non-local correlations that break every rule of isolated objecthood. When two particles remain coupled across light years, the isolated object is no longer a viable description. To navigate this level of reality, we must move past the particle. The new bedrock primitive is the Fabricon. A Fabricon is the minimal, invariantly distinguishable relational terminal of the universal fabric. Minimality here does not refer to spatial size. It refers to terminal lawful distinction. A Fabricon is the smallest unit of law that can be identified before the structural identity collapses into noise. A primitive's identity relies on invariant structural persistence. It exists because its mathematical signature remains identical even as the surrounding environment transforms. This replaces a universe of things in a void with an architecture of relational structural laws. Discarding the object illusion is a mandatory strategic requirement. Engineering the true bedrock of reality requires us to manipulate the invariant signatures that generate matter in the first place. A macro-level zoom reveals the microscopic topology of a single Fabricon. It is a complex, braided entity, constantly twisting and interlocking with itself. This complex terminal is governed by an active invariant signature bundle. This bundle ensures the terminal remains distinguishable across every transformation. This is the exact mathematical mechanism preserving the Fabricon's identity, the topology, trace, symmetry triad. Topology is the first structural anchor. While the geometry warps and deforms erratically, the topological link remains rigidly unbroken, dictating which traits must survive the pressure. The second anchor is trace. This luminous pathway serves as the ontological memory of the unit. It witnesses and records the specific history of the Fabricon's lawful passage. Finally, symmetry provides the geometric bounds. This is a constitutive constraint that organizes which transformations are allowed and which are rejected. A primitive is terminal only because its invariant identity cannot be reduced below this triad. If you break the triad, the distinction itself vanishes. While a Fabricon cannot be reduced downward, it acts as a generator upward. We call this terminal generativity. This is lawful weaving. Multiple distinct vector knots interlock their traces precisely, maintaining their individual topological signatures while forming a combined structure. As they multiply and tessellate, they do not form simple clumps of mass. They generate structurally rigid, higher-order fabrics. Fractal Quantum Field Theory explains how these fabrics stack recursively. In this framework, scale is an active internal structural layer. The single mesh duplicates into vertical interconnected layers, each coupled to the others. We are redefining the field. It is not a background continuum, but a recursively articulated woven fabric regime. What we once perceived as empty space is actually a densely engineered multi-scale topological substrate. Because particles emerge from these fabrics, they are derived phenomena, not absolute primitives. As the field churns, motion concentrates into a dense, stabilized vortex knot. This is a stabilized excitation, a persistent topological mode within the larger fabric. Physical sensors detect this specific node. Because the node is stable and carries a distinguishable signature, sensors falsely classify it as a solid, independent particle. The stability of that node relies entirely on the topological protection of the field. It is not persisting because it is a hard object. It is persisting because the field's mathematics forbids its erasure. Locality is a conditional property of the regime. It is not a universal bedrock. Particle interactions are the observable, surface-level manifestations of deeper topological weaving. Classical physics treats the observer as a passive witness. But in high-complexity regimes, the distinction of a Fabricon cannot be articulated without an active reference. We enter the observer-active regime. Here, the mathematical signature of the primitive is ill-posed, unless an observer structure is included to stabilize the distinction. This is measurement participation. The observer structure is a constitutive act that physically alters the target. It provides the stabilization necessary for the terminal to remain a distinguishable unit. This integration permanently rewrites the signature, adding an observer index. The terminal is no longer a bare object, it is an observer-bound Fabricon. The observer is modeled as a lawful, generative structure. It provides the stabilization morphisms required for the field to remain coherent in these active regimes. If the observer index cannot be factored out mathematically, the observer is a structural absolute. They are an internal component of the reality regime. At this level of complexity, the witness and the witnessed fabric are structurally inseparable, terminating the myth of objective realism. We can now assemble the complete post-atomic physical architecture. It begins at the absolute base with layer A. These are the Fabricons, relational invariant terminals setting the base logic of distinction. These terminals weave together into recursive FQFT fields, forming a dense interlocking mesh tier. From this mesh, localized spikes emerge. These are the stabilized manifestations, the persistent topological modes. Finally, smooth spherical markers enclose those spikes. This is the top tier, particle realism. The objects we see are simply the most superficial layer of the stack. Reality is generated by lawful structural persistence through transformation. It is woven, not assembled. Mastery of the physical world requires engineering this underlying topological fabric. We must bypass the emergent illusions and manipulate the bedrock itself.